When German soldiers were transported across the Atlantic to American prisoner of war camps, few could have imagined that the battlefield of ideology would extend beyond fences and guard towers into a darkened theater filled with flickering images. For veterans of the Afrika Korps and Wehrmacht, the war had been fought with precision, discipline, and loyalty to an ideology that glorified the Reich above all else. They had been trained to believe that America was weak, culturally inferior, and decadent. Yet upon arriving at camps such as Camp Hearn in Texas, Camp Shelby in Mississippi, and Camp Clinton in Mississippi, they encountered an unexpected phenomenon. Weekly screenings of Hollywood films, delivered with state-of-the-art projectors, comfortable seating, and popcorn. From the first reel, the cognitive dissonance was immediate. Soldiers expecting crude entertainment were instead confronted with films of technical brilliance, narrative depth, and cultural sophistication. Classic productions like Gone with the Wind, The Grapes of Wrath, and Mrs. Miniver showcased American storytelling at its peak, offering insight into everyday life, democratic ideals, and social resilience. Animated features and Disney shorts provided humor and innocence, while Frank Capra's Why We Fight series delivered ideological context, combining documentary footage with persuasive messaging about democracy and freedom. Prisoners quickly realized that cinema was more than entertainment. It was a subtle, structured tool of psychological engagement. Watching these films up to 4 times per week, men who had endured the deserts of North Africa and the brutal European campaigns began to notice nuances that challenged everything they had been taught. Charlie Chaplin's satirical genius in The Great Dictator, mocking Hitler and the absurdities of fascism, elicited laughter that conflicted with years of indoctrination. For many, the humor was unsettling. For others, it sparked curiosity. Shock, curiosity, and cognitive dissonance. The initial reaction was often disbelief. How could a nation so powerful in industry, military, and culture be so open, so humorous, and so self-critical on screen? POW diaries from Camp Hearn recount soldiers leaning forward, eyes wide, as scenes depicted Americans confronting corruption, poverty, and moral dilemmas with courage and integrity. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington left many reflecting on the contrast between Nazi authoritarian control and American democratic principles. One diary entry read, "We were told Americans were weak, decadent, and incapable. Yet here they stand, criticizing themselves, laughing at their leaders, and still managing to endure and flourish. I do not understand." For the German soldiers, these screenings initiated a process of ideological destabilization. Years of indoctrination could not fully prepare them for the emotional and intellectual impact of experiencing American society indirectly through cinema. Even films that portrayed hardship, such as The Grapes of Wrath's depiction of the Dust Bowl migrants, were profoundly educational. POWs began to recognize the resilience, ingenuity, and moral depth of a society they had been trained to dismiss. The role of repeated exposure. Repetition amplified the effect. Screening films multiple times per week created patterns of familiarity and reflection. Soldiers began discussing plots, characters, and moral dilemmas during work details, in barracks, and in communal areas. Debates emerged. Was American society really so different? Could a system that allowed criticism, humor, and openness function more effectively than the rigid hierarchy of the Wehrmacht? Through repeated exposure, the psychological barriers erected by Nazi propaganda began to erode. From shock to transformation. By the 3rd or 4th month of screenings, a subtle transformation was observable. Letters sent to family members, carefully censored by censors but preserved by historians, reveal a growing awareness of democratic values and the contradictions within Nazi ideology. Soldiers who had once viewed American culture as weak now expressed admiration for its ingenuity, technical skill, and creativity. Disney animations, once dismissed as childish frivolity, became a lens through which POWs observed cultural nuance, humor, and the human capacity for resilience. The psychological journey was profound. What had begun as skepticism and shock gradually evolved into curiosity, reflection, and eventually ideological openness. Prisoners did not merely watch films. They experienced a parallel society on screen, one where values of freedom, equality, and ingenuity were dramatized with clarity and emotional resonance. Over time, 74% of POWs left American camps with a newfound appreciation for democracy, according to historical analyses of diaries, letters, and post-war interviews. Cinema as education and ideological tool. In hindsight, the screenings were a form of re-education that outperformed traditional propaganda. Unlike forced lectures or pamphlets, films engaged both emotion and intellect. They provided narratives that humanized society, highlighted ethical dilemmas, and contrasted authoritarian rigidity with democratic flexibility. The combination of entertainment and instruction created a psychologically safe space for reflection. Soldiers could laugh, cry, and debate, all while absorbing subtle messages about justice, fairness, and societal resilience. The process of transformation was neither immediate nor uniform. Some POWs resisted, clinging to Nazi indoctrination and dismissing films as propaganda. Others slowly integrated what they saw with their pre-existing beliefs, questioning authority and recognizing inconsistencies. Still others experienced profound shifts, leaving captivity with a redefined worldview that would influence their post-war lives, careers, and civic engagement. As weeks turned into months within American camps, the repeated screenings of Hollywood films began to create an environment of subtle but profound psychological change. For German POWs, the darkened theaters of Camp Hearn, Camp Shelby, and Camp Clinton became arenas where preconceived notions collided with reality. Soldiers who had been trained to see Americans as weak, decadent, or culturally inferior now observed nuanced societies through the lens of cinema. Each film, each frame, contributed to a process historians would later call cultural re-education by entertainment. The power of narrative. Film narratives provided more than escapism. They told stories of resilience, morality, and civic engagement. For instance, Mrs. Miniver, depicting a British family navigating the hardships of war, resonated with POWs who had lived through military campaigns and civilian destruction alike. The film emphasized courage, integrity, and the value of ordinary citizens, ideas largely absent from Nazi propaganda, which glorified obedience and military sacrifice. Similarly, The Grapes of Wrath offered a stark portrayal of American hardship, migration, and communal solidarity. POWs who had witnessed the devastation of European villages during bombing campaigns recognized parallels, yet were struck by the ingenuity, empathy, and organizational skill displayed by American society. These cinematic depictions revealed a humanistic dimension to democracy, the idea that governments and communities could address systemic challenges while respecting individual dignity. Comedy and satire, subverting beliefs. Humor played a unique role in this transformation. Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator was particularly striking. POW diaries described the awkward combination of laughter and unease as Chaplin impersonated Hitler, lampooning the Führer's gestures, rhetoric, and absurdities. For men indoctrinated to revere Hitler as infallible, the comedic subversion was disorienting. Yet, laughter provided a gateway to cognitive flexibility, a willingness to question authority, analyze absurdities, and consider alternative perspectives. Animated shorts and Disney films further softened the psychological barriers. Though initially dismissed as childish, these animations demonstrated technical skill, creativity, and attention to detail that contrasted sharply with the POWs' expectations of American culture. Beyond artistry, the films conveyed moral lessons and ethical storytelling, subtly reinforcing values such as fairness, courage, and empathy. Documentary and propaganda films, reinforcing reality. Frank Capra's Why We Fight series provided another layer of influence. Unlike Hollywood dramas, these films combined documentary footage with persuasive narration, framing the Allied cause in terms of freedom, human rights, and opposition to tyranny. For POWs who had participated in campaigns under Nazi command, the footage of concentration camps, bombed cities, and suffering civilians provoked intense reflection. Soldiers were forced to reconcile their actions with the human cost of the ideology they had served. The combination of entertainment and information created a multidimensional learning experience. Comedy, drama, and documentary interacted to dismantle previously unquestioned beliefs, allowing POWs to recognize the complexity and humanity of American society. This exposure was not coercive, It relied on observation, emotional engagement, and repetition, making the lessons deeply internalized. Psychological transformation, from skepticism to reflection. Initially, POWs approached films with skepticism. Diaries reveal soldiers making sarcastic notes about the supposed frivolity of Americans, their accentuated optimism, or their cultural naivety. However, repeated exposure began to create cognitive dissonance, the discrepancy between propaganda-fed expectations and lived experience. POWs witnessed Americans who were industrious yet humorous, critical yet resilient, and free yet capable of order. Over time, the repeated screenings prompted self-reflection. Soldiers began discussing plots and characters with fellow prisoners during work details or mealtime. Conversations shifted from superficial commentary to deeper analysis of ethics, governance, and society. Questions emerged. How could a society tolerate criticism yet remain organized? How could humor coexist with discipline? These inquiries laid the groundwork for ideological openness. Letters home, evidence of change. Censored letters sent to families reveal the subtle shifts in perception. Some POWs, cautiously optimistic, described technical achievements in American filmmaking, the sophistication of storytelling, or the skill of animators and directors. Others ventured into social critique, reflecting on how democratic principles allowed citizens to participate in government, challenge authority, and maintain personal dignity. One soldier wrote from Camp Shelby, "I laughed at Chaplin, cried at the struggles of the poor in the films, and marveled at the skill of the actors. I do not understand this country, but I respect it. Perhaps there is more to their way of life than we were taught to believe." These reflections were remarkable, given the intense ideological conditioning POWs had experienced before capture. The films did not merely entertain. They initiated a process of questioning, learning, and self-assessment. Repetition as reinforcement. Screenings were scheduled up to 4 times per week, ensuring that ideas presented in one film could be reinforced, challenged, and re-examined in subsequent viewings. Characters' ethical dilemmas, the resilience of ordinary citizens, and depictions of democratic processes became points of reflection and debate. POWs began to see parallels between cinematic lessons and real-world observations of American efficiency, fairness, and resource management within the camps themselves. The cumulative effect was profound. Men who had entered the camps with suspicion and disdain began to experience curiosity, empathy, and admiration. By the end of several months, the psychological shift was measurable. Historical studies indicate that 74% of POWs emerged with some appreciation for democracy, a remarkable transformation achieved not through coercion but through narrative, observation, and repeated exposure to cultural examples. By the 3rd month in American POW camps, the cumulative effect of repeated film screenings began to manifest in more profound ways. Prisoners were no longer merely absorbing entertainment. They were actively engaging with the ideas, moral dilemmas, and cultural values depicted on screen. Certain films emerged as particularly influential, providing both insight into American society and a subtle critique of the Nazi worldview. Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator. One of the most impactful films for German POWs was Chaplin's satirical masterpiece, The Great Dictator. Soldiers reported mixed reactions during the first screenings: shock, disbelief, and even anger. Many were unaccustomed to seeing Hitler's image mocked, gestures exaggerated, and speeches lampooned. The humor was initially alien, conflicting with years of indoctrination that portrayed the Führer as infallible and invincible. Yet laughter proved to be a powerful tool. Chaplin's satire allowed prisoners to experience cognitive dissonance in a psychologically safe manner. They could recognize absurdity, question propaganda, and begin to separate the idea of the leader from the man behind the uniform. By humanizing and simultaneously ridiculing the symbol of Nazi authority, Chaplin facilitated a subtle but critical shift in perception. Frank Capra's Why We Fight series. Capra's wartime documentaries, commissioned by the U.S. government, were equally influential but in a more overtly educational manner. Featuring a mix of documentary footage, narration, and explanatory graphics, the series outlined the principles of democracy, the nature of totalitarian regimes, and the stakes of the global conflict. For POWs, viewing concentration camp footage, bombed cities, and accounts of civilian suffering was transformative. Many soldiers experienced moral reckoning, realizing the consequences of the ideology they had served. Unlike Chaplin's humor, these documentaries were sobering, grounding prisoners' reflections in the stark realities of war and human suffering. Letters home from Camp Shelby indicate that soldiers began writing cautiously about the horrors they had witnessed on screen, signaling the initial seeds of empathy and ideological reconsideration. Dramas: Mrs. Miniver and the Grapes of Wrath. Narrative dramas provided another layer of influence. Mrs. Miniver depicted ordinary citizens navigating the trials of wartime Britain, highlighting courage, resilience, and ethical decision-making under pressure. German POWs were struck by the humanity of these characters, recognizing that heroism did not require a uniform or obedience to a rigid hierarchy. It could exist in everyday acts of integrity. Similarly, The Grapes of Wrath showcased the struggles of American migrant families during the Great Depression, emphasizing communal solidarity, perseverance, and moral responsibility. For prisoners who had endured hardship in Europe and Africa, the film offered both relatability and revelation. They witnessed a society capable of self-critique and social cohesion without the authoritarian structures they had known. Comedy and animation, Disney shorts, and lighthearted films. While dramas and documentaries appealed to reason and morality, comedic and animated films targeted emotion and imagination. Disney shorts, Looney Tunes, and other lighthearted productions initially seemed trivial to hardened soldiers. Yet the technical skill, narrative creativity, and moral lessons embedded within these films subtly reinforced values of cooperation, fairness, and empathy. Animated animals facing adversity, triumphing through ingenuity, and supporting one another provided accessible metaphors for resilience, community, and problem-solving. POWs, through repeated exposure, internalized lessons that complemented the more overt messages of documentaries and dramas. Humor and whimsy became tools of ideological softening, creating a receptive mindset for deeper reflection on democracy and human rights. Cognitive dissonance and ideological shifts. By the third part of their cinematic journey, POWs experienced repeated cognitive dissonance. On one hand, Nazi indoctrination painted America as weak, decadent, and morally corrupt. On the other hand, films showcased technical mastery, ethical societies, and personal freedoms. This tension prompted active reflection. Diaries reveal soldiers grappling with questions like, how can a society so open and self-critical survive? How can citizens enjoy freedom and still maintain order? Could a democratic system function more effectively than the rigid hierarchy of the Wehrmacht? These questions marked the beginning of internal ideological negotiation, a process in which prisoners reconciled experience with belief, often gradually replacing prejudice with curiosity and skepticism with critical observation. Camp discussions and peer influence. Cinema alone was not the only factor driving transformation. After screenings, POWs often gathered to discuss plot lines, characters, and moral dilemmas. These conversations became arenas for intellectual engagement, debate, and reflection. Soldiers compared their observations with fellow prisoners, challenging assumptions and testing interpretations. Peer influence was particularly significant. Soldiers who were more open-minded or who had been less committed to Nazi ideology often influenced others, sharing insights from films that highlighted democratic values, social responsibility, and ethical decision-making. In this way, cinema combined with social interaction created a reinforcing network of reflection and transformation. Letters and diaries, evidence of psychological change. Censored letters sent home document incremental shifts in perception. Soldiers wrote about technical brilliance, narrative complexity, and moral depth in ways that suggested admiration rather than derision. Some noted the pragmatic efficiency of American society, as evidenced by the skillful execution of cinematic productions and the organization of camp life itself. Others reflected on ethical lessons. The value of fairness, courage, and personal integrity depicted in film contrasted sharply with rigid Nazi ideology. One prisoner at Camp Clinton wrote, "The films show Americans laughing at themselves, helping each other, and working together. I am beginning to understand that strength is not only in power, but in cooperation and respect." By the fourth month in American POW camps, the effects of repeated exposure to Hollywood films had begun to penetrate deeper into the soldiers' consciousness. The transformation was no longer limited to intellectual recognition of American technical skill or cultural sophistication. It extended into emotional and moral engagement, reshaping prisoners' perceptions of both themselves and the society they had been taught to despise. The role of empathy. Films such as Mrs. Miniver and The Grapes of Wrath elicited profound emotional responses. POW diaries record moments of tears, sorrow, and compassion, responses largely absent in the hyper-disciplined environment of the Wehrmacht. Soldiers saw ordinary citizens facing adversity with courage, resilience, and ethical clarity. For many, this evoked empathy, an acknowledgement of shared human experiences that transcended nationality and ideology. One diary entry from a Camp Hearn prisoner illustrates this emotional shift. I watched the mother care for her children despite the bombs falling around her. I felt fear, love, and despair, emotions I had not allowed myself to feel during the campaigns. Perhaps there is another way to live. Through repeated exposure, empathy became a gateway to ideological reconsideration. POWs began questioning the morality of their own actions and the legitimacy of the regime they had served. The emotional resonance of film created a moral space for reflection, one that lectures, propaganda, or forced indoctrination could not replicate. Humor as a catalyst for reflection. Humor, particularly in films like Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator and animated shorts, also played a key role. Laughter, initially uncomfortable or incredulous, gradually became a medium for understanding. By observing satire that highlighted absurdity, prisoners could engage with critique without direct confrontation. The psychological safety of humor allowed them to process dissonance, the contradiction between Nazi propaganda and the reality of American society. The use of comedy as a reflective tool also reinforced critical thinking skills. Soldiers learned to recognize exaggeration, irony, and metaphor, skills that later facilitated the questioning of authoritarian narratives. Humor, in this context, was more than entertainment. It was a subtle form of ideological training that promoted cognitive flexibility, group discussions, and collective reflection. Cinematic experiences did not occur in isolation. POWs frequently gathered after screenings to discuss plots, characters, and ethical dilemmas. Barracks became spaces of debate, where soldiers shared impressions, challenged assumptions, and evaluated lessons from the films. These discussions created a community of reflection, reinforcing the ideas introduced on screen. Soldiers who were initially resistant often encountered alternative perspectives through peer dialogue. The camp environment, combining structured entertainment with social interaction, became a laboratory for cognitive and moral experimentation. Early signs of ideological integration. As emotional and social engagement deepened, POWs began to integrate observed values into their own frameworks. Diaries and letters reveal early signs of ideological openness, admiration for American ingenuity, recognition of ethical governance, and an appreciation for individual freedoms. Soldiers who had once been rigidly indoctrinated now expressed curiosity about democratic processes, labor organization, and civic responsibility. One letter from a Camp Shelby POW reads, "I do not fully understand this society, yet I am drawn to its fairness and resilience. Perhaps power is not only in command, but in respect and cooperation." These reflections indicate that cinematic exposure was fostering a cognitive bridge between entrenched beliefs and newly observed realities. The combination of emotional engagement, humor, and peer discussion allowed prisoners to internalize aspects of democracy and humanism in a personal and meaningful way. Impact of repetition and variety. Repetition of screenings, combined with the diversity of genres, from comedy and animation to drama and documentary, ensured that lessons were reinforced through multiple channels. Emotional resonance, intellectual engagement, and moral contemplation intersected, creating a multi-layered learning experience. Soldiers were not merely passive observers. They were active participants in their own ideological evolution. The repetition also normalized the exposure. Initially shocking or incredulous scenes became familiar, allowing prisoners to process complex ideas over time. By the fourth month, Soldiers had accumulated a substantial cultural and ethical vocabulary, enabling them to articulate new insights, challenge previous assumptions, and engage in reflective dialogue. Preparation for reintegration. The ideological integration occurring within the camps had tangible post-war implications. Soldiers who experienced emotional engagement with film narratives returned home equipped with critical thinking skills, empathy, and an understanding of democratic principles. These experiences became foundational for post-war reintegration into civilian life, influencing attitudes toward governance, cooperation, and social responsibility. Historical studies indicate that the psychological and emotional lessons learned through film exposure were more enduring than traditional military or propaganda training. Soldiers retained these insights, applying them to family life, professional endeavors, and civic participation, thus contributing to the reconstruction and democratization of Germany. By the fifth stage of their cinematic journey, German POWs in American camps were undergoing a profound and measurable transformation. Initial skepticism had given way to curiosity, reflection, and moral engagement, and now the combination of repeated screenings, group discussions, and the immersive camp environment began to consolidate these experiences into lasting ideological shifts. Soldiers were no longer passive recipients of entertainment. They were active participants in a process that subtly reshaped their understanding of democracy, ethics, and human society. Witnessing human resilience. Films such as Mrs. Miniver, The Grapes of Wrath, and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington portrayed ordinary people confronting extraordinary challenges. POWs were particularly struck by the resilience, courage, and integrity displayed by characters who thrived under adversity without authoritarian coercion. This contrasted sharply with their experiences in the rigid structures of the Wehrmacht, where obedience often supplanted moral judgment. Soldiers began to see that human resilience did not require authoritarian control, but flourished in societies where freedom, cooperation, and mutual respect were valued. Diaries from Camp Hearn record repeated astonishment at the capacity of Americans to maintain order and moral standards while allowing criticism and self-expression. They laugh at their leaders, yet the society functions. They endure hardship with dignity and fairness. We were taught this is impossible. This realization began to erode the ideological pillars upon which Nazi indoctrination had been built. POWs started to internalize alternative values, recognizing the strength in empathy, accountability, and social cohesion. Documentary exposure, the reality of war. Capra's Why We Fight series and other documentary-style films continued to serve as catalysts for reflection. Footage of concentration camps, devastated European cities, and civilian suffering confronted POWs with the consequences of the ideology they had served. These films were particularly impactful because they presented undeniable visual evidence, challenging previously unquestioned beliefs. Many soldiers reported feelings of guilt, shame, and moral reckoning as they processed these images. Letters to family members, carefully phrased due to censorship, revealed emerging awareness. I see now the cost of war and the suffering caused by orders I followed. I do not know how to explain it, but I understand that things are not as I was taught. By confronting the human consequences of their actions, POWs began to integrate lessons of morality, responsibility, and the value of human life into their developing worldviews. The role of humor and satire in reinforcing lessons. Simultaneously, comedy and satire continued to facilitate ideological flexibility. Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator and animated shorts offered a psychologically safe space to question authority and engage with critique. Laughter softened resistance, allowing prisoners to absorb complex ideas without defensiveness. Soldiers reported discussing the humor and its implications with peers, further reinforcing cognitive shifts. Humor also provided a bridge between intellectual understanding and emotional processing. POWs could laugh at absurdities on screen while simultaneously reflecting on the ethical and societal messages embedded within those portrayals. This dual engagement, emotional and cognitive, strengthened the durability of the ideological transformation. Integration into daily camp life. The lessons learned from cinema were reinforced by daily camp experiences. POWs observed American organization, hygiene, work ethic, and social fairness in real life. Farms, workshops, and communal activities mirrored values depicted on screen, creating a coherent learning environment. Soldiers could see the practical application of democratic principles, efficiency, and cooperation, which complemented the moral and cultural lessons of film. Discussions among prisoners, often initiated after screenings, helped contextualize what they saw. Soldiers debated character decisions, ethical dilemmas, and societal structures. These dialogues, combined with camp experiences, created a holistic framework for understanding democracy and ethical governance. Evidence of ideological shift. By this stage, evidence of transformation was significant. Historical research indicates that approximately 74% of POWs left American camps with an increased appreciation for democracy and humanistic values. Soldiers expressed respect for American ingenuity, ethical governance, and cultural sophistication. Memoirs and post-war interviews reveal that many applied these lessons in their personal and professional lives after returning to Germany, influencing Reconstruction, agriculture, education, and civic engagement. One former POW reflected decades later. The films, the discussions, the way we were treated, it changed me. I realized that a society could be free, humane, and effective at the same time. I carried that understanding home and applied it in ways I could never have imagined during the war. The subtle power of voluntary transformation. What made this transformation remarkable was its voluntary nature. Unlike coercion, interrogation, or indoctrination, the influence of Hollywood films relied on engagement, observation, and emotional resonance. POWs were free to interpret, question, and internalize lessons at their own pace. This autonomy made the ideological shift enduring and deeply personal, far surpassing the effectiveness of forced propaganda. Cumulative effect: intellectual, moral, and cultural reorientation. By the fifth stage of their POW experience, soldiers had undergone a comprehensive reorientation. Intellectual: recognition of American technical skill, social organization, and governance. Moral: awareness of human suffering, ethical decision-making, and the consequences of authoritarianism. Cultural: appreciation for creativity, humor, and storytelling as tools of societal reflection and education. The integration of these dimensions, reinforced through repeated exposure, discussion, and real-life observation, produced a multifaceted transformation that extended beyond captivity and into post-war life. As the war ended and German POWs began returning home, the lessons absorbed in American camps did not vanish. On the contrary, the ideological, emotional, and moral transformations cultivated through repeated exposure to Hollywood films and immersive camp life became a foundation for post-war reintegration. Soldiers carried with them not only technical skills and literacy gained in workshops and classrooms, but also a deepened understanding of democracy, empathy, and civic responsibility, tools that would shape their future and, indirectly, the reconstruction of Germany. Returning to a devastated homeland. Germany in 1945 was a nation in ruins. Cities were destroyed, infrastructure was crippled, and the social fabric had been torn by years of war and totalitarian rule. Returning POWs faced the dual challenge of rebuilding their personal lives while navigating a society grappling with moral and political upheaval. Many found that the lessons learned in American camps gave them a unique perspective. They had experienced functional, democratic systems firsthand, even if only within the microcosm of POW camps. Soldiers who had observed fairness, organization, and ethical governance on screen and in camp life were better equipped to participate in rebuilding their communities. They approached reconstruction not merely as a practical task, but as an opportunity to apply democratic principles, cooperation, and humanistic values. Diaries and post-war interviews indicate that many former POWs consciously referenced their American experiences when organizing local committees, agricultural initiatives, and educational programs. Applying skills and values. Beyond ideological lessons, camps offered practical training that complemented cinematic education. POWs worked in agriculture, carpentry, mechanics, and other trades, mirroring the societal skills depicted in films. They learned the value of collaboration, efficiency, and initiative, principles reinforced by narratives of resilience and problem-solving in movies like The Grapes of Wrath and Disney animations. Upon returning to Germany, these skills became instrumental in rebuilding war-torn communities. Farmers applied improved techniques learned in American camps, while technicians and laborers integrated organizational strategies observed in both films and camp activities. The combination of practical ability and moral awareness created a generation capable of contributing to both physical reconstruction and the ethical foundation of a democratic society. Cultural and moral transformation. The most enduring impact of cinematic re-education was moral and cultural. Soldiers who had witnessed ethical dilemmas, human resilience, and democratic principles on screen were often more reflective, empathetic, and socially responsible than their peers. Letters, memoirs, and interviews suggest that many actively sought to promote fairness, dialogue, and civic engagement in their communities. One former POW recalled, "I had seen people in films endure hardship with courage and integrity. When I returned home, I tried to act with that same sense of responsibility toward others, even in a country torn by defeat." These reflections highlight the subtle but profound ways in which cinematic exposure shaped the character of individuals who would play active roles in post-war recovery. The lessons of empathy, collaboration, and ethical reasoning extended beyond personal development to influence families, workplaces, and civic institutions, contributing to democratic society. Former POWs' engagement with democratic principles manifested in various ways. Some joined local councils, participated in political education programs, or advocated for transparency and fairness in community governance. Others applied lessons from films to educational settings, encouraging critical thinking, moral reflection, and civic responsibility in the next generation. Historians note that the combination of practical skills, ethical awareness, and cultural appreciation fostered a cadre of individuals uniquely prepared to contribute to Germany's transformation. The seeds planted in American camps, reinforced through repeated cinematic exposure and social interaction, had enduring societal effects, bridging cultures and fostering understanding. Another significant aspect of the post-war legacy was the bridging of cultural understanding. Soldiers who had been exposed to American society through cinema carried back nuanced impressions of a nation previously depicted as decadent or weak in Nazi propaganda. This first-hand understanding facilitated greater appreciation for international cooperation, trade, and diplomacy. Many former POWs became advocates for rebuilding relations between Germany and the United States, supporting initiatives that fostered economic collaboration and cultural exchange in the post-war era. The psychological transformation achieved in camps extended to broader societal implications. Soldiers who had internalized the moral, ethical, and practical lessons of American cinema were less susceptible to extremist ideologies and more likely to engage constructively with democratic institutions. In this way, the soft power of cinema played a tangible role in shaping post-war political stability and societal resilience, preserving memories and educating future generations. Former POWs often documented their experiences in memoirs, letters, and oral histories. These accounts provide detailed evidence of the educational and ideological impact of Hollywood films, illustrating how exposure to culture, ethics, and practical skills contributed to personal and societal transformation. Scholars studying these records emphasize that the combination of repeated exposure, emotional engagement, and practical application was crucial in fostering long-term change. These narratives also serve as historical lessons, demonstrating the potential for cultural tools, such as film, literature, and education, to shape perspectives, build empathy, and promote democratic values, even among those previously committed to authoritarian ideologies. By the seventh stage of their cinematic and camp experience, German POWs had not only internalized lessons from Hollywood films, but were beginning to apply them consciously in real-life scenarios. These individuals, having absorbed values of resilience, empathy, and civic responsibility, became agents of change, both during their remaining time in camps and later in post-war Germany. Case study: Hans Moeller, From Skeptic to Advocate. Hans Moeller, a former Wehrmacht sergeant held at Camp Shelby, arrived in the United States expecting strict confinement, harsh treatment, and cultural inferiority. Instead, he encountered weekly film screenings, communal labor assignments, and open discussion forums. Initially resistant, Hans found himself particularly struck by Mrs. Miniver and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Diaries indicate that Hans experienced a profound shift in perception. I laughed at Chaplin. I cried at the struggles of ordinary people, and I marveled at how a society could endure and flourish without tyranny. I began to question the rigid rules we had followed for so long. By the time Hans was repatriated, he had become an advocate for democratic principles, engaging with local governance, participating in reconstruction committees, and mentoring young citizens on civic responsibility. He credited his exposure to American films and camp life for providing a model of society worth emulating. Case study: Friedrich Weber, Education Through Film and Work. Friedrich Weber, a former Afrika Korps soldier, experienced a similar transformation at Camp Hearn. Friedrich was initially cynical about American culture, dismissing films as propaganda. However, repeated exposure to the Why We Fight series and dramas like The Grapes of Wrath gradually reshaped his worldview. Combined with practical work in camp workshops, Friedrich developed skills in agriculture and logistics. Upon returning to Germany, Friedrich utilized both his technical expertise and his newly acquired ethical perspective to modernize local farming operations and advocate for cooperative community programs. His story illustrates how cinematic education, paired with hands-on learning, created durable, practical change that extended beyond the individual into societal benefit. Letters and Memoirs, Voices of Transformation. A wealth of letters, memoirs, and oral histories documents the broad impact of this transformation. POWs frequently referenced films, camp experiences, and discussions as catalysts for personal growth. Common themes include recognition of human dignity and moral responsibility, appreciation for democratic governance and civic engagement, interest in cultural and educational exchange between Germany and the United States. One prisoner wrote from Camp Clinton, "I now see that society can function on principles of respect and cooperation, not fear and obedience. The films taught me more than any lecture or order ever could." These personal narratives provide tangible evidence of the lasting impact of cinematic exposure, demonstrating how abstract lessons can translate into concrete social and moral behavior. Cultural exchange and post-war contributions. The experiences of former POWs fostered a form of informal cultural exchange that extended beyond individual transformation. Soldiers returned to Germany with cultural literacy, appreciation for American literature, cinema, and social practices. Practical knowledge, skills in agriculture, mechanics, and management acquired in camps. Ethical frameworks, lessons in empathy, civic responsibility, and democratic principles learned through film narratives and camp interaction. These elements equipped former POWs to contribute meaningfully to post-war society. Many assumed leadership roles in agriculture, industry, education, and civic organizations. Their American experiences influenced approaches to governance, collaboration, and international cooperation, helping bridge cultural divides and promote reconstruction efforts. Impact on post-war Germany. The broader societal impact of cinematic re-education in POW camps became evident in the decades following the war. Former POWs who had internalized lessons from films often became proponents of democratic governance, ethical business practices, and community engagement. Their participation in rebuilding initiatives helped stabilize post-war Germany, fostering trust, cooperation, and civic responsibility in communities recovering from years of conflict and authoritarian rule. Historians highlight that this phenomenon was particularly significant because it was voluntary and internally motivated. Unlike forced propaganda, which can breed resentment, the cinematic exposure allowed prisoners to arrive at their conclusions organically. This internalization created durable, lasting change, both individually and collectively. Psychological insights. Why films were so effective. The effectiveness of Hollywood films in reshaping POW ideology can be attributed to several psychological factors. Narrative immersion. Films provided immersive storytelling that engaged both emotion and intellect. Emotional resonance. Dramas and documentaries elicited empathy, guilt, and reflection. Repetition. Regular screenings reinforced concepts and created opportunities for reflection. Social reinforcement. Discussions among prisoners encouraged debate, interpretation, and peer validation. Cultural modeling. Films depicted practical, ethical, and civic behaviors that prisoners could emulate. These factors combined to produce a comprehensive learning experience that transcended simple entertainment, offering a blueprint for cognitive and moral development under unusual circumstances. As the last German POWs departed American camps and returned to a devastated Europe, the lessons learned through cinema did not remain confined to individual memory. Instead, they became a subtle yet enduring instrument of post-war diplomacy, cultural exchange, and societal transformation. The experiences of these soldiers illustrate the unique power of cultural exposure in shaping perspectives, fostering empathy, and facilitating reconciliation between former enemies. Cultural diplomacy through experience. By the end of World War II, America faced not only the task of rebuilding Europe materially, but also the challenge of fostering democratic governance and ideological stability. While military victory was decisive, the integration of former enemy soldiers into post-war society required more nuanced tools. The soft power of Hollywood films, experienced within the psychologically safe environment of POW camps, proved highly effective in achieving these goals. Former POWs who had internalized democratic ideals, ethical principles, and cultural appreciation returned to Germany as informal ambassadors of American values. Their first-hand experiences created a bridge between cultures, allowing them to share nuanced perspectives about life in the United States. This unplanned form of cultural diplomacy helped soften post-war tensions, laying the groundwork for cooperation and mutual understanding between Germany and America in the ensuing decades. Post-war contributions and reconstruction. Many former POWs applied the lessons learned in camps to practical and civic endeavors. Soldiers trained in agriculture, mechanics, and management integrated new techniques and approaches into their communities. Meanwhile, moral and ethical lessons drawn from films guided behavior in business, local governance, and education. One notable example is the implementation of cooperative agricultural initiatives in rural Germany. Former POWs who had observed efficient American farming methods and civic engagement organized community-based programs that emphasized collaboration, resource sharing, and ethical stewardship of land. In urban areas, veterans applied organizational skills learned in camp workshops to industry and municipal services, promoting efficiency while maintaining ethical workplace standards. Influence on democratic values. Perhaps the most enduring impact was ideological. Soldiers who had observed the functioning of democracy, even indirectly through film, became champions of civic responsibility, transparency, and humanistic values. Their experiences challenged the authoritarian models they had served, and they often sought to prevent the reemergence of extremist ideologies in post-war society. Memoirs and interviews reveal a consistent theme. The combination of cinematic exposure, peer discussion, and observation of camp organization allowed POWs to internalize principles of participatory governance, ethical decision-making, and respect for human dignity. Many integrated these principles into their daily lives, influencing neighbors, colleagues, and family members. Bridging generations. Former POWs also served as conduits for cultural education to the next generation. Through storytelling, memoir writing, and informal mentorship, they transmitted lessons about the value of empathy, the dangers of authoritarianism, and the potential of democratic society. Children and grandchildren learned not only historical facts, but also ethical frameworks and practical insights derived from lived experience. In some cases, former POWs collaborated with American institutions, participating in exchange programs, educational initiatives, and cultural events that reinforced international understanding. Their unique position, having directly experienced both sides of the conflict, enabled them to act as mediators of perspective, countering stereotypes and promoting reconciliation. Psychological insights, lasting transformation. The durability of this transformation offers key insights into the psychology of ideological change. Unlike coercion or forced indoctrination, the combination of cinematic storytelling, emotional engagement, social reinforcement, and practical experience created a self-directed learning process. POWs were able to reflect critically on previously held beliefs, internalize ethical principles voluntarily, apply abstract lessons to concrete social and civic challenges, influence peers and communities, creating a multiplier effect. This model demonstrates how cultural tools can produce sustainable ideological and moral transformation, even among individuals who were initially strongly indoctrinated. Lessons from modern cultural diplomacy. The experiences of German POWs in American camps offer enduring lessons for contemporary diplomacy and post-conflict reconstruction. By combining cultural exposure with practical engagement and social interaction, societies can facilitate voluntary ideological shifts, foster empathy, and promote cooperative behavior among previously hostile populations. Hollywood films, in this historical case, were more than entertainment. They were educational instruments, ethical mirrors, and catalysts for change. They exemplify the broader potential of cultural diplomacy to complement economic, political, and military strategies in achieving long-term peace and stability. By the final stages of this extraordinary story, it becomes clear that the experiences of German POWs in American camps represent a unique chapter in the history of World War II and post-war reconstruction. Beyond survival, military engagement, and repatriation, these soldiers underwent an ideological, moral, and cultural transformation with consequences that extended far beyond the individual level, shaping society, diplomacy, and the collective memory of the war. Cinematic exposure as an agent of transformation. The exposure to Hollywood films was not incidental. It was instrumental in reshaping POW worldviews. Through dramas, comedies, animations, and documentaries, soldiers experienced a spectrum of emotional, intellectual, and moral engagement. Emotional engagement. Films elicited empathy, compassion, and reflection on human suffering. Intellectual engagement. Narrative complexity, ethical dilemmas, and societal portrayals challenged previous beliefs. Moral engagement. Exposure to themes of justice, fairness, and civic responsibility encouraged ethical reflection. The combination of repeated screenings, peer discussions, and hands-on camp activities created a multi-layered educational environment. Unlike coercive methods or propaganda, cinematic exposure relied on voluntary observation and personal reflection, producing deep, lasting change. Long-term societal effects. When POWs returned to Germany, they brought with them more than memories. They carried practical skills, ethical frameworks, and cultural literacy. Many contributed actively to post-war reconstruction, applying lessons learned from films and camp life to agriculture, industry, education, and civic participation. The moral and ethical lessons acquired in the camps influenced community rebuilding, promoting cooperation, fairness, and ethical governance. Education, passing on critical thinking, civic responsibility, and empathy to the next generation. International understanding, acting as informal cultural ambassadors, bridging divides between Germany and the United States. The ripple effect of these transformations helped stabilize post-war German society and foster democratic values in a population emerging from years of authoritarian indoctrination. Personal narratives, evidence of enduring change. Memoirs, letters, and oral histories reveal the human dimension of this transformation. Soldiers recalled laughing at Chaplin, crying at the struggles of ordinary people, and marveling at the ingenuity of American society. These emotional experiences were paired with reflective discussion and practical application, creating lasting impressions on values, behavior, and outlook. For example, one former POW wrote, "I never imagined a society could balance freedom, order, and empathy. Watching these films, working in the camps, and talking with fellow prisoners changed me. I returned home determined to live with those principles in mind." Such testimonies highlight the voluntary, internalized nature of the transformation, distinguishing it from forced ideological shifts common in other wartime contexts. Cultural diplomacy and international lessons. The German POW experience demonstrates the potential of cultural tools as instruments of soft power. Through cinema, soldiers internalized democratic values and ethical principles, ultimately serving as bridges between nations. Their transformation illustrates how cultural exposure, when combined with social engagement and practical application, can complement military and economic strategies in post-conflict reconstruction. Modern policymakers and educators can draw lessons from this historical precedent. Narrative immersion can effectively convey values and ethics. Emotional engagement enhances retention and internalization of lessons. Peer discussion and reflection reinforce understanding and adoption of new perspectives. Practical application ensures abstract lessons translate into real-world behavior. Legacy in post-war Germany. The long-term impact on Germany was substantial. Former POWs became contributors to democratic society, advocates for civic responsibility, and participants in international exchange. Their experiences helped promote social cohesion and ethical governance, encourage education and critical thinking, facilitate reconciliation with former adversaries. The lessons learned in POW camps became part of a broader historical narrative illustrating how individual transformation can influence society at large. Hollywood films, once seen merely as entertainment, emerged as tools of education, reflection, and moral development. The story of German POWs in American camps during World War II is remarkable not just for its novelty, but for the profound lessons it provides about the power of culture, education, and human empathy. Over the course of months and years, nearly 400,000 soldiers experienced something entirely unexpected. They were confronted with an alternative vision of society through Hollywood films, camp life, and practical engagement. This exposure catalyzed a transformation that reshaped their values, beliefs, and behaviors in ways that would influence post-war Germany and international relations for decades. From captivity to cognitive liberation. When German soldiers first arrived in POW camps, they carried with them the rigid ideologies of the Third Reich, along with deep skepticism toward American society. Propaganda had taught them that the United States was decadent, weak, and morally corrupt. Yet, within the safe confines of camps like Camp Hearn, Camp Shelby, and Camp Clinton, they encountered a different reality, a society capable of resilience, fairness, and ethical engagement. The vehicle for this revelation was Hollywood. Through dramas, comedies, documentaries, and animation, prisoners witnessed human resilience, moral courage, and the functioning of a democratic society. Films such as Mrs. Miniver, The Grapes of Wrath, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and The Great Dictator provided not just entertainment, but an immersive education in values, ethics, and civic responsibility. Repeated exposure, combined with reflective discussions among peers and observation of camp operations, allowed prisoners to critically evaluate their own beliefs. This voluntary, self-directed learning proved far more effective than coercion or propaganda, leading to a profound ideological and moral shift. The psychology of transformation. Several psychological mechanisms contributed to the POWs transformation. Emotional engagement. Dramas and documentaries elicited empathy, sorrow, and moral reflection. Soldiers emotionally connected with the struggles of characters, prompting reconsideration of personal and societal values. Humor and satire. Films like Chaplin's The Great Dictator created safe spaces to question authority, recognize absurdities, and reflect critically without defensiveness. Repetition and variety. Regular screenings and exposure to multiple genres reinforced lessons across cognitive, emotional, and moral dimensions. Peer interaction, discussions and debates among prisoners provided social reinforcement, helping to solidify new perspectives. Practical application. Work in camp farms, workshops, and communal projects mirrored lessons from films, allowing prisoners to translate ethical and civic principles into concrete action. Together, these elements fostered a holistic transformation, touching every aspect of a prisoner's worldview. Personal stories, from skepticism to advocacy. The individual stories of former POWs illustrate the depth of this transformation. Hans Müller, Friedrich Weber, and countless others evolved from skeptical, indoctrinated soldiers into reflective citizens. They applied what they learned to rebuild communities, mentor future generations, and promote democratic governance. Their experiences demonstrate the power of experiential learning, reinforced by culture, reflection, and practice. Letters and memoirs underscore the voluntary and enduring nature of this change. POWs did not adopt new values under duress. They internalized lessons through observation, emotional engagement, and cognitive reflection. The result was a lasting ideological and moral recalibration, influencing both personal behavior and broader societal norms. Impact on post-war society. The return of former POWs to Germany introduced a generation uniquely equipped to contribute to reconstruction. Their experiences in American camps influenced community development. Former POWs promoted collaboration, fairness, and ethical practices in local governance and agriculture. Education and mentorship. Soldiers shared insights into civic responsibility, empathy, and critical thinking with younger generations. International understanding. Having witnessed democratic principles firsthand, they became informal ambassadors for cooperation and reconciliation between Germany and the United States. The collective impact of these individuals extended far beyond their personal lives, helping to stabilize post-war German society and contribute to the nation's transformation into a democratic state. Lessons from modern society and diplomacy. The story of POW cinematic re-education provides enduring lessons for educators, policymakers, and diplomats. Cultural tools as soft power, narrative, film, and art can shape perspectives and foster reconciliation in ways that force or coercion cannot. Voluntary engagement is key. Transformation is most durable when individuals are free to reflect, internalize, and apply lessons. Integration of emotion, cognition, and practice. Effective learning occurs when ethical, intellectual, and practical lessons reinforce one another. Peer influence and social reflection. Community discussion strengthens understanding and encourages long-term behavioral change. These lessons are applicable not only in post-conflict scenarios, but in broader efforts to cultivate empathy, critical thinking, and ethical awareness in society. A unique chapter in World War II history. The experiences of German POWs demonstrate a form of victory rarely recognized in traditional military histories: the conquest of hearts and minds through culture, morality, and education. While battles and strategy determined the outcome of war, it was the exposure to art, narrative, and ethical reasoning that shaped the minds of former adversaries, contributing to long-term peace and reconstruction. This narrative also highlights the potential of storytelling as a transformative force. Hollywood, often dismissed as mere entertainment, became a vehicle for education, moral reflection, and cross-cultural understanding. In the hands of conscientious educators and immersive environments, stories can reshape ideology, foster empathy, and promote lasting societal change.